Hey crew, it's Pitt and I'm back with some more philosophy. Today we are diving back into the works of Mr. Georg Hegel. This is the science of logic. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It's not the format for everyone, but people find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. But before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material and the link for my book, so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive into what is going to be an exceptionally long one, so buckle in and hang tight. We are in for 34 pages today. Chapter 2, the essentialities or the determinations of reflection. Reflection is a determined reflection. Accordingly, essence is determined essence, or it is essentiality. Reflection is the shining of essence within itself. Essence, as infinite immanent, turning back, is not immediate simplicity, but negative simplicity. It is a movement across moments that are distinct, in absolute mediation with itself. But in these moments, it shines. The moments are, therefore, themselves determinations reflected into themselves. First, essence is simple, self-reference, pure identity. This is its determination, one by which it is rather the absence of determination. Second, the specifying determination is difference. Difference, which is either external or indefinite, diversity in general, or opposed diversity or opposition. Third, as contradiction, this opposition is reflected into itself and returns to its foundation. Remark: the determinations of reflection have customarily been singled out in the form of propositions, which were said to apply to everything. They were said to have the status of universal laws of thought that lie at the base of all thinking, to be inherent, absolute, and indemonstrable, but immediately and indisputably recognized and accepted as true by all thought upon grasping their meaning. Thus, identity, as an essential determination, is enunciated in the proposition: everything is equal to itself, A equals A, or negatively, A cannot be A and not A at the same time. On the face of it, it is difficult to see why only these simple determinations of reflection should be expressed in this particular form and not also the rest, such as the categories that belong in the sphere of being. We would then have, for instance, such propositions as everything is, everything has an existence, etc., or again, everything has a quality, a quantity, and so on. For being, existence, etc., are as logical determinations the predicates of everything in general. A category, according to the etymology of the word and Aristotle's definition of it, is what is said and asserted of every existent. But the difference is that a determinateness of being is essentially a transition into the opposite of it. The negative of every determinateness is just as necessary as the determinateness itself, as immediate determinacies. Each determinateness immediately confronts the others. If any of these categories is therefore expressed in a proposition, the opposite proposition comes up as well, both offering themselves with equal necessity and, as immediate claims, each has at least equal right. Each would therefore require a proof as against the other, and both claims would no longer possess the character of immediately true and indisputable propositions. The determinations of reflection are, on the contrary, not qualitative in kind. They are self-referring and consequently abstract from the determinateness of others. Further, since as determinacies they are self-references, they therefore already have the propositional form in them. For proposition and judgment differ mainly because in the former the content constitutes the connection itself of the terms, or is a specific connection. Judgment, on the contrary, converts the content into a predicate, which is a universal determinate-ness by itself, distinct from its connection, which is the simple copula. Whenever a proposition is to be transformed into a judgment, the determinate content, if, for instance, it resides in a verb, is transformed into a participle, in order, in this way, to separate the determination itself from its connection with the subject. The propositional form is instead more closely allied to the determinations of reflection, which are eminently reflected positiveness. Only, when they are enunciated as universal laws of thought, they are in need of a subject of their connection, and this subject is the everything, or an A, which equally means all being and each being. Now, this propositional form is, for one thing, something superfluous. The determinations of reflection are to be regarded in and for themselves. Moreover, the propositions suffer from the drawback that they have being, everything, for subject. They thus bring being into play again and enunciate the determinations of reflection, the identity, etc., of anything, as a quality which a something would have within, not in any speculative sense, but in the sense that the something, as subject, persists in such a quality as an existent. Not that it is passed over into identity, etc., as into its truth and essence. Finally, although the determinations of reflection have the form of self-equality and are therefore unconnected to an other and without opposition, they are, in fact, determinate against one another, and, as it will result on closer examination, or is immediately evident in them in the case of identity, diversity, and opposition, and are not therefore exempt from transition and contradiction because of their reflective form. Therefore, on closer examination, these several propositions are set up as absolute laws of thought are opposed to each other. They contradict each other and mutually sublate each other. If everything is identical with itself, then it is not different, it is not opposed, has no ground. Or, if it is assumed that there are no two things alike, that is, that all things are different from each other, then A is not equal to A, nor is A in opposition, etc. The assumption of any of these propositions does not allow the assumption of any other. The thoughtless examination of them enumerates them one after the other, so that they appear unconnected. It merely adverts to their reflectiveness without paying attention to their other moment, to the positiveness, or the determinateness, as such, which propels them on to transition or to their negation. A. Identity. 1. Essence is simple immediacy as sublated immediacy. Its negativity is its being. It is equal to itself in its absolute negativity, by virtue of which otherness and reference to other have, as much as such, simply disappeared into pure self-equality. Essence is therefore simple self-identity. This self-identity is the immediacy of reflection. It is not that self-equality which being is, or also nothing, but a self-equality which, in producing itself as unity, does not produce itself over again, as from another, but is a pure production, from itself and in itself, essential identity. It is not, therefore, abstract identity or an identity which is the result of a relative negation preceding it, one that separates indeed from it, indeed what it distinguishes from it, but, for the rest, leaves it existing outside it, the same as before, after as before. Being, as every determinateness of being, has rather sublated itself not relatively, but in itself, and this simple negativity, the negativity of being in itself, is the identity itself. In general, therefore, it is still the same essence. Remark 1. 1. Thought that keeps to external reflection and knows of no other thought except that of external reflection does not attain to identity as we have just grasped it, nor does it recognize essence, which is the same. Such a thought will always have only abstract identity in mind, and outside and alongside it, difference. In its opinion, reason is no more than a loom intertwining warp, say identity, and woof, say difference, joining them externally. Or, if it turns to analysis, now specifically pulling out identity and at the same time also obtaining difference alongside it, now a comparing and also a differentiating at the same time. A comparing in that it abstracts from difference, and a differentiating in that it abstracts from the comparing. One must completely dismiss these assertions and these opinions concerning what reason does, since they are, as it were, of merely historical interest. It is rather the consideration of all things that reveals in them that each is self-unlike and contradictory in its equality with itself, and each self-identical in its difference, in its contradiction. That everything intrinsically is this movement of transition of one of these determinations to the other, and that everything is this transition because each determination is itself within it, the opposite of itself. The concept of identity, a simple negativity that refers itself to itself, is not the product of external reflection, but derives from being itself. Contrary to this, the identity that stays distant from difference and the difference that stays distant from identity are the products of external reflection and of an abstraction that arbitrarily clings to this point of indifference. 2. This identity is, in the first instance, essence itself, not yet a determination of it. It is the entire reflection, not a distinct moment of it. As absolute negation, it is negation immediately negating itself, a non-being and difference that vanishes as it arises, or a distinguishing by which nothing is distinguished but which immediately collapses within itself. But the non-being of the other is the sublating of the other and hence of the distinguishing itself. Here, then, distinguishing is present as self-referring negativity, as a non-being which is the non-being of itself. A non-being which does not have its non-being in an other but has it within itself. What is present, therefore, is self-referring, reflected difference, or pure absolute difference. Or identity is immanent reflection, reflection which is such only as in a repelling, and it is this repelling as immanent reflection, repelling that immediately recovers itself. And so, identity is identity as difference, which is identical with itself. But difference is identical with itself only inasmuch as it is not identity, but absolute non-identity. But again, non-identity is absolute to the extent that it does not contain anything of its other, but is only itself. That is, to the extent that it is identity with itself. Internally, therefore, identity is absolute non-identity, but it is also the determination of identity over against non-identity. For as immanent reflection, it posits itself as its own non-being. It is the whole. But as reflection, it posits itself as its own moment, as the positedness from which it is the turning back into itself. Thus, identity is such only as a moment of itself, as determination of simple self-equality over against absolute difference. Remark 2. In this remark, I shall examine identity more closely as the principle of identity, which is commonly adduced as the first law of thought. In its positive formulation, A equals A, this proposition is at first no more than the expression of empty tautology. It is rightly said, therefore, that this law of thought is without content, and that it leads nowhere. It is thus to an empty identity that they cling, those who take it to be something true, insisting that identity is not difference, but that the two are different. They do not see that in saying, identity is different from difference, they have thereby already said that identity is something different. And since this must also be conceded as the nature of identity, the implication is that to be different belongs to identity, not externally, but within it, in its nature. But further, inasmuch as these same individuals hold firm to their unmoved identity, of which the opposite is difference, they do not see that they have thereby reduced it to a one-sided determinateness, which, as such, has no truth. They are conceding that the principle of identity only expresses a one-sided determinateness, that it only contains formal truth, truth abstract and incomplete. Immediately implied is that in this correct judgment, however, is that the truth is complete only in the unity of identity and difference, and, consequently, that it only consists in this unity. When asserting that formal identity is incomplete, there is vaguely present to one's mind the totality measured against which that identity is incomplete. But the moment one insists that identity is absolutely separate from difference, and in this separation takes it to be something essential, valid, true, then what transpires from these two contradictory claims is only the failure to reconcile these two thoughts. That identity is abstract, identity essential, but that, as such, is equally incomplete. What is lacking is the awareness of the negative moments, as which, in these claims, identity itself is displayed, or, when this is said, that identity is identity essentially as separation from difference, or in the separation from difference. Then, right there, we have the express truth about it, namely, that identity consists in being separation as such, or in being essentially in the separation. That is, it is nothing for itself, but is rather moment of separation. As to the other confirmation about the absolute truth of the principle of identity, this is made to rest on experience, insofar as appeal is made to the experience of every consciousness. For anyone presented with this proposition, A is a tree is a tree, immediately grants it, and is satisfied that the proposition is self-evident and in need of no further justification or demonstration. On the one hand, this appeal to experience, that every consciousness acknowledges the principle universally, is a mere manner of speaking. For nobody will want to say that the abstract proposition A is A has actually been tried out on every consciousness. The appeal to actual experience is therefore not in earnest, but is rather only an assurance that if the said experiment were made, universal acknowledgement of the proposition would be the result. And if it is not the abstract proposition as such that is meant, but the proposition in concrete application, from which application the abstract proposition would then have to be developed, then the claim to the universality and immediacy of the latter would consist in the fact that every consciousness assumes it, or implies it, as foundation, and indeed does so in its every utterance. But the concrete and the application are precisely in the reference that connects simple identity with a manifold, which is different from it, expressed as a proposition. The concrete would be first of all a synthetic proposition. From this concrete itself, or from the synthetic proposition expressing it, abstraction could indeed extract the principle of identity through analysis, but, in fact, it would not then leave experience as is, but would have altered it, since in experience the identity was rather in unity with difference. And this is the immediate refutation of the claim that abstract identity is, as such, something true. For what transpires in every experience is the very opposite, namely, identity only united with difference. On the other hand, the experiment with pure principle of identity is also all too often made, and it demonstrates clearly enough how the truth contained in the principle is regarded. If, for instance, to the question, "What is a plant?" the answer is given, "A plant is a plant," the whole company on which this answer is tried out would both grant it, and at the same time unanimously declare that the statement says nothing. If anyone opens his mouth and promises to announce what God is and says that God is God, expectation is cheated, for a different determination was anticipated. And though the proposition is absolute truth, very little is made of such absolute verbiage. Nothing will be held to be more tedious, more aggravating, than a conversation which only chews the cud. However true the cud might nevertheless be. Let us take a closer look at what makes such a truth tedious. So, the beginning. The plant makes moves in the direction of saying something, of adducing a further determination. But since only the same is repeated, the opposite has happened instead. Nothing has occurred. Such talk of identity, therefore, contradicts itself. Identity, instead of being in itself the truth and the absolute truth, is thus rather the opposite. Instead of being the unmoved simple, it surpasses itself into the dissolution of itself. More is entailed, therefore, in the form of the proposition expressing identity than simple abstract identity. Entailed by it is this pure movement of reflection, in the course of which there emerges the other, but only as reflective shine, as immediate disappearing. A is a beginning that envisages a something different before it to which the A is would proceed, but the A is never gets to it. A is A. The difference is only a disappearing, and the movement goes back into itself. The propositional form can be regarded as the hidden necessity of adding to abstract identity the extra factor of that movement. Thus, an A is added, a plant or some other substrate, a useless content with no significance. But it constitutes the difference that seems to associate itself by accident. If instead of A or any other substrate, identity itself is assumed, identity is identity, it is then thereby admitted that any other substrate could be assumed instead of this identity. Consequently, if appeal is to be made to what appearances indicate, then the result is this, that in the expression of identity, difference also immediately emerges, or, more precisely, in accordance with what has been said, that this identity is a nothing, is negativity, the absolute difference from itself. The other expression of the principle of identity, A cannot be A and not A at the same time, is in a negative form. It is called the principle of contradiction. No justification is normally given for how the form of negation, by which this principle is distinguished from the other, comes to identity. But this form is implied by the pure movement of reflection, which identity is, by the simple negativity which is contained in a more developed form, by the just stated second formulation of the principle. A is enunciated, and A not A, which is the pure other of A. But this not A only shows itself in order to disappear. In this proposition, therefore, identity is expressed as negation of negation. A and not A are distinct. The two terms are distinguished with reference to one and the same A. Here, identity is displayed, therefore, as this differentiation of the terms in the one connection, or as the simple difference in the terms themselves. From this, it is clear that the principle of identity itself, and still more the principle of contradiction, are not of merely analytical, but of synthetic nature. For the latter expresses not only empty simple self-equality, but the other of this self-equality, and not just this other in general, but as absolute inequality, contradiction in itself. As for the principle of identity itself, we have shown that it entails the movement of reflection, identity as the disappearing of otherness. Thus, the result of this consideration is this: 1. The principle of identity, or contradiction, when meant to express merely abstract identity in opposition to difference as a truth, is not a law of thought, but expresses rather the opposite of it. 2. These two principles contain more than is meant by them, namely, this opposite absolute difference itself. B. Difference. 1. Absolute difference. Difference is the negativity that reflection possesses in itself, the nothing which is said in the identity discourse, the essential moment of identity itself, which, as the negativity of itself, at the same time, determines itself and is differentiated from difference. This difference is difference in and for itself, absolute difference, the difference of essence. It is difference in and for itself, not difference through something external, but self-referring, hence simple difference. It is essential that we grasp absolute difference as simple. In the absolute difference of A and not A from each other, it is the simple not, which, as such, constitutes the difference. Difference itself is a simple concept. In this, so it is said, two things differ in that, etc. In this, that is, in one and the same respect, relative to the same basis of determination. It is the difference of reflection, not the otherness of existence. One existence and another existence are posited as lying outside each other. Each of the two existences, thus determined over against each other, has an immediate being for itself. The other of essence, by contrast, is the other in and for itself, not the other of some other which is to be found outside it. It is simple determinateness in itself. Also, in the sphere of existence, did otherness and determinateness prove to be of this nature, simple determinateness, identical opposition. But this identity showed itself only as the transition of a determinateness into the other. Here, in the sphere of reflection, difference comes in as reflected, so posited as it is in itself. 2. Difference in itself is the difference that refers itself to itself. Thus, it is the negativity of itself, the difference not from another, but of itself from itself. It is not itself, but its other. What is different from difference, however, is identity. Difference is, therefore, itself and identity. The two together constitutes difference. Difference is the whole and its moment. One can also say that difference, as simple difference, is no difference. It is such only with reference to identity. Even better, that as difference, it entails itself and this reference equally. Difference is the whole and its own moment, just as identity equally is its whole and its moment. This is to be regarded as the essential nature of reflection, and as the determined primordial origin of all activity and self-movement. Both difference and identity make themselves into moment or positiveness, because, as reflection, they are negative self-reference. Difference, thus, as unity of itself and of identity, is internally determined difference. It is not the transition into another, not reference to another outside it. It has its other, identity, within, and, in like matter, identity, in being included in the determination of difference, has not lost itself in it as its other, but retains itself therein. Is the reflection into itself of difference, its moment. 3. Difference has both these moments, identity and difference. Thus, the two are both a positiveness, determinateness. But in this positiveness, each refers to itself. The one, identity, is itself immediately the moment of imminent reflection. But no less is the other difference. Difference in itself, reflected difference. Difference, inasmuch as it has two such moments, which are themselves reflections into themselves, is diversity. 2. Diversity. 1. Identity internally breaks apart into diversity because, as absolute difference in itself, it posits itself as the negative of itself, and these, its two moments, itself and the negative of itself, are reflections into themselves, are identical with themselves, or precisely because it itself immediately sublates its negating, and is, in its determination, reflected into itself. The different subsists as diverse, indifferent to any other, because it is identical with itself, because identity constitutes its base and element, or the diverse remains what it is, even in its opposite, identity. Diversity constitutes the otherness as such of reflection. The other of existence has immediate being, where negativity resides for its foundation. But in reflection, it is self-identity, the reflected immediacy, that constitutes the subsistence of the negative and its indifference. The moments of difference are identity and difference itself. These moments are diverse when reflected into themselves, referring themselves to themselves. Thus, in the determination of identity, they are only self-referring. Identity is not referred to difference, nor is difference referred to identity. Hence, inasmuch as each of these moments is referred only to itself, the two are not determined with respect to each other. Now, because in this way the two are not differentiated within, the difference is external to them. The diverse moments, therefore, conduct themselves with respect to each other, not as identity and difference, but only as moments different in general, indifferent to each other and to their determinateness. 2. In diversity, as the indifference of difference, reflection has in general become external. Difference is only a positiveness, or as sublated, but is itself the whole reflection. On closer consideration, both identity and difference are reflections, as we have just established. Each is the unity of it and its other, each is the whole. But the determinateness, to be only identity or only difference, is thus a sublated something. They are not, therefore, qualities, since their determinateness, because of the immanent reflection, is at the same time only as negation. What we have is therefore this duplicity, immanent reflection as such and determinateness as negation or positiveness. Positiveness is the reflection that is external to itself. It is negation as negation, and consequently, indeed, in itself self-referring negation and immanent reflection, but only in itself implicitly. Its reference is to a something external. Reflection in itself and external reflection are thus the two determinations in which the moments of difference, identity and difference, are posited. They are the moments themselves as they have determined themselves at this point. Immanent reflection is identity, but determined to be indifferent to difference, not to have difference at all, but to conduct itself towards difference as identical with itself. It is diversity. It is identity that has so reflected itself into itself that it is truly is the one reflection of the two moments into themselves. Both are immanent reflections. Identity is the reflection of the two. The identity which has difference within it only as an indifferent difference is diversity in general. External reflection, on the contrary, is their determinate difference, not as absolute immanent reflection, but as a determination towards which the implicitly present reflection is indifferent. Its two moments, identity and difference themselves, are thus externally posited, are not determinations that exist and for themselves. Now, this external identity is likeness, and external difference is unlikeness. Likeness is indeed identity, but only as a positiveness, an identity which is not in and for itself. Unlikeness is equally difference, but an external difference which is not in and for itself, the difference of the unlike itself. Whether something is like or unlike something else is not the concern of either the like of the unlike. Each refers only to itself. Each is in and for itself what it is. Identity or non-identity, in the sense of likeness or unlikeness, depend on the point of view of the third external to them. 3. External reflection connects diversity by referring it to likeness and unlikeness. This reference, which is a comparing, moves back and forth from likeness to unlikeness and from unlikeness to likeness. But this back and forth referring of likeness and unlikeness is external to these determinations themselves. Moreover, they are not referred to each other, but each for itself is referred to a third. In this alternation, each immediately stands out on its own. External reflection is as much external to itself. Determinate difference is negated absolute difference. It is not simple difference. Therefore, not an immanent reflection, but has this reflection outside it. Hence, its moments come apart and both refer, each also outside the other, to the immanent reflection confronting them. In reflection, thus alienated from itself, likeness and unlikeness present themselves, therefore, as themselves unconnected, and reflection keeps them apart, for it refers them to one and the same something, by means of in so far, from this side or that, and from this view or that. Thus, diverse things that are one and the same, when likeness and unlikeness are said of them, are from one side like each other, but from another side unlike. And insofar as they are unlike, to that extent they are not unlike. Likeness thus refers only to itself, and unlikeness is equally only unlikeness. Because of this separation from each other, they sublate themselves. Precisely that which should save them from contradiction and dissolution, namely that something is like another in one respect, but unlike in another. Precisely this keeping of likeness and unlikeness apart is their destruction. For both are determinations of difference. They are references to each other, each intended to be what the other is not. The like is not the unlike, and the unlike is not the like. Both have this connecting reference essentially, and have no meaning outside it. As determinations of difference, each is what it is, as different from its other. But because of their indifference to each other, the likeness is referred to itself, and similarly is unlikeness a point of view of its own, and a reflection unto itself. Each, therefore, is like itself. Difference has vanished, since they have no determinateness to oppose them. In other words, each is consequently only likeness. Accordingly, this indifferent viewpoint, or the external differences, sublates itself, and it is in itself the negativity of itself. It is the negativity which, in comparing, belongs to that which does the comparing. This latter oscillates from likeness to unlikeness and back again. Hence, it lets the one disappear into the other and is, in fact, the negative unity of both. This negative unity transcends at first what is compared as well as the moments of comparing as a subjective operation that falls outside them. But the result is that this unity is in fact the nature of likeness and unlikeness themselves. Even the independent viewpoint that each of these is rather the self-reference that sublates their distinctness, and so too themselves. From this side, as moments of external reflection and as external to themselves, likeness and unlikeness disappear together into their likeness. But this, their negative unity, is in addition also posited in them, for their reflection implicitly exists outside them. That is, they are like the likeness and unlikeness of a third, of another than they themselves are. Thus, the like is not the like of itself, and the unlike, as the unlike, not of itself but of an unlike to it, is itself the like. The like and the unlike is each, therefore, the unlike of itself. Each is thereby this reflection. Likeness, that it is itself and the unlikeness. Unlikeness, that it is itself and the likeness. Likeness and unlikeness constituted the side of positiveness as against what is being compared, or the diverse, which, as contrasted with them, has determined itself as implicitly existent reflection. But this positiveness has consequently equally lost its determinateness as against this reflection. Likeness and unlikeness, the determinations of external reflection, are precisely the merely implicitly existent reflection, which the diverse as such was supposed to be. Its only indeterminate difference. Implicitly existent reflection is a self-reference without negation, abstract self-identity, and therefore positiveness itself. The merely diverse, thus, passes over through the positiveness into a negative reflection. The diverse is difference, which is merely positive, hence a difference which is no difference, hence a negation that negates itself within. Likeness and unlikeness themselves, the positiveness, thus returns through indifference or through implicitly existing reflection back into negative unity with themselves, into the reflection which is the implicit difference of likeness and unlikeness. Diversity, the indifferent sides of which are just as much simply and solely moments of negative unity, is opposition. Remark. Diversity, like identity, is expressed in a proposition of its own, but the two propositions otherwise remain indifferent to each other, each valid on its own, irrespective of the other. All things are different, or no two things are alike. This principle is, in fact, opposed to the principle of identity, for it says A is something distinctive, therefore A is also not negative A. Or A is unlike another, hence it is not A in general, but is rather a distinctive A. In the proposition expressing identity, the A can be replaced by any other substrate. But when A is something distinctive, it cannot be interchanged with anything else. Of course, it is not supposed to be different from itself, but only from some other. But this diversity is its own determination. As self-identical, A is indeterminateness, but as determinate, it is the opposite thereof. It no longer has only self-identity, but also carries a negation within, and hence a difference within it of itself from itself. That everything is different from everything else is an altogether superfluous proposition, for in the plural of things there is already implied a multitude and totally indeterminate diversity. The principle, however, there are no two perfectly like things, expresses more than that, for it expresses determinate difference. Two things are not merely two. Numerical multiplicity is only the repetition of one, but are rather differentiated by a determination. The proposition that there are no two things which are like each other strikes the imagination as strange, as in the anecdote about court where Leibniz propounded it, occasioning the ladies to search among the leaves of the tree to see whether two alike could be found. Happy times for metaphysics those, when it was practiced at court and no greater effort was called for to demonstrate its propositions than to compare the leaves of trees. The reason why the principle strikes us as strange lies in what has just been said, namely, because two, or any numerical plurality, does not yet contain a diversity which is determinate, and because diversity, as such, taken in abstraction, is at first indifferent with respect to likeness and unlikeness. Ordinary thinking, when it goes on to determine it, assumes that these two moments are themselves indifferent to each other, so that each is sufficient for the determination without the other, the mere likeness of things sufficient without their unlikeness. As if the things would be diverse, even if only numerically many, diverse in general without being unequal. The law of diversity, on the contrary, proclaims that things are diverse from each other by virtue of unlikeness, that the determination of unlikeness belongs to them just as much as that of likeness, for only the two together constitute determinate difference. Now, this proposition that the determination of unlikeness pertains to all things is surely in need of demonstration. It cannot be advanced as an immediate proposition, for it is the ordinary norm of cognition itself to require a demonstration for linking diverse determinations together into one synthetic proposition, or to indicate some third term in which such determinations are mediated. Such a demonstration would have to display the transition from identity to diversity, and the transition then from diversity to determinate diversity, to unlikeness. But this is not ordinarily done. The demonstration would follow from the fact that diversity, or external difference, is in truth reflected into itself, is difference within, that the indifferent subsistence of the diverse is a mere positiveness, and therefore not external. Indifferent difference, but one reference of the two moments. In this lies also the dissolution, the nothingness of the law of diversity. Two things are not perfectly alike, so they are at the same time alike and unalike. Alike by the very fact that they are things, or two in general, for each is a thing or one just as well as any other, and each is therefore the same as the other. Unlike, however, ex hypothesi. What we then have is this determination that the two moments, likeness and unlikeness, are different in one and the same thing, or that their differentiating difference is at the same time one and the same reference. Here is where we have the transition into opposition. The at the same time of the two predicates will indeed be held fragmented by means of the insofar. Two things are insofar like, insofar unlike, or they are alike from one side and viewpoint, but unlike from another. In this way, the unity of likeness and unlikeness is kept away from a thing. And what would be the thing's own reflection, and the immanent reflection of likeness and unlikeness, is fixed as a reflection external to the thing. But it is this reflection which, in one and the same activity, distinguishes the two sides of likeness and unlikeness. By the same token, contains in them one activity, and lets the one shine reflected into the other. The ordinary tenderness for things, the overriding worry of which is that they do not contradict themselves, forgets instead, here as elsewhere, that contradiction is not thereby dissolved, but is rather shoved elsewhere into subjective or external reflection. Forgets that the two moments of this reflection, of which it speaks as assumed facts, in its effort at removing them or displacing them, are in fact contained in it as sublated, and each referring to the other in one unity. 3. Opposition. In opposition, the determinate reflection, difference, is brought to completion. Opposition is the unity of identity and diversity. Its moments are diverse in one identity, and so they are opposites. Identity and difference are the moments of difference as held inside difference itself. They are reflected moments of unity. Likeness and unlikeness are instead the externalized reflection. Their self-identity is not only the indifference of each other towards the differentiated from it, but towards being in and for itself as such. Theirs is a self-identity that contrasts with identity reflected into itself, hence an immediacy, which is not reflected into itself. The positiveness of the sides of external reflection is therefore a being, just as their non-positiveness is a non-being. On closer consideration, the moments of opposition are positiveness reflected into itself, or determination in general. Positiveness is likeness and unlikeness. These two, reflected into themselves, constitute the determinations of opposition. Their immanent reflection consists in that each is within it the unity of likeness and unlikeness. Likeness is only in a reflection which compares according to the unlikeness, and is therefore mediated by its other indifferent moment. Similarly, unlikeness is only in the same reflective reference in which likeness is. Each of these moments, in its determinateness, is therefore the whole. It is the whole because it also contains its other moment, but this its other is an indifferent existent. Thus, each contains a reference to its non-being, and its reflection into itself, or the whole, only as essentially referring to its non-being. This self-likeness, reflected into itself and containing the reference to unlikeness within it, is the positive, and the unlikeness that contains within itself the reference to its non-being, to likeness, is the negative. Or again, both are positiveness. Now, insofar as the differentiated determinateness is taken as differentiated determinate reference of positiveness to itself, opposition is, on the one hand, positiveness reflected into its likeness with itself, and, on the other hand, it is the same positiveness reflected into its inequality with itself, the positive and the negative. The positive is positiveness as reflected into self-likeness, but what is reflected is positiveness, that is, the negation as negation. And so this immanent reflection has the reference to the other for its determination. The negative is positiveness as reflected into unlikeness, but positiveness is the unlikeness itself, and so this reflection is therefore the identity of unlikeness with itself and absolute self-reference. Each, therefore, equally has the other in it. Positiveness reflected into self-likeness has the unlikeness, and positiveness reflected into self-unlikeness, the likeness. The positive and the negative are thus the sides of opposition that have become self-subsisting. They are self-subsisting because they are the reflection of the whole into itself, and they belong to opposition insofar as the latter is determinateness, which, as the whole, is reflected into itself. Because of their self-subsistence, the opposition which they constitute is implicitly determinate. Each is itself and its other. For this reason, each has its determinateness not in another, but within. Each refers to itself only as referring itself to its other. This has a twofold aspect. Each is the reference to its non-being as the sublating of this otherness in itself. Its non-being is thus only a moment in it. But, on the other hand, here positiveness has become a being, an indifferent subsistence. The other of itself, which each contains, is therefore also the non-being of that in which it should be contained only as a moment. Each is, therefore, only to the extent that its non-being is. The two an identical reference. The determinations which constitute the positive and the negative consist, therefore, in that the positive and the negative are, first, absolute moments of opposition. Their subsistence is indivisibly one reflection. It is one mediation, in which each is by virtue of the non-being of its other, hence by virtue of its other or its own non-being. Thus they are simply opposites, or each is only the opposite of the other. The one is not yet the positive and the other not yet the negative, but both are negative with respect to each other. Each, therefore, simply is, first, to the extent that the other is. It is what it is by virtue of the other, by virtue of its own non-being. It is only positiveness. Second, it is to the extent that the other is not. It is what it is by virtue of the non-being of the other. It is reflection into itself. The two, however, are both the one mediation of opposition as such, in which they simply are only positive moments. Moreover, this mere positiveness is reflected into itself in general, and according to this moment of external reflection, the positive and the negative are indifferent towards the first identity, where they are only moments, or, again, because that first reflection is the positives and the negatives' own reflection into itself. Each is indifferent towards its reflection into its non-being, towards its own positiveness. The two sides are thus merely diverse, and because their determinateness that they are positive or negative, constitutes their positiveness as against each other. Each is not specifically so determined internally, but is only determinateness in general. To each side, therefore, there belongs indeed one of the two determinacies, the positive or the negative. But the two can be interchanged, and each side is such as can be taken equally as positive or negative. But, in third place, the positive and the negative are not only a positive being, nor are they something merely indifferent, but their positiveness, or the reference to the other in the one unity, which they themselves are not, is rather taken back into each. Each is itself positive and negative within. The positive and the negative are the determination of reflection in and for itself. Only in this reflection of the opposite into itself is the opposite either positive or negative. The positive has within it the reference to the other in which the determinateness of the positive consists. And the same applies to the negative. It is not negative as contrasted with another, but has the determinateness by which it is negative within. Each is thus self-subsistent unity existing for itself. The positive is indeed a positiveness, but in such a way that the positiveness is, for it, posited being as sublated. It is the non-opposed, the sublated opposition, but as the side of the opposition itself. As positive, it is indeed a something which is determined with reference to an otherness, but in such a way that its nature is not to be something posited. It is the immanent reflection that negates otherness. But its other, the negative, is itself no longer positiveness or a moment, but itself a self-subsisting being. So, the negating reflection of the positive is internally determined to exclude this being, which it is non-being from itself. Thus, the negative, as absolute reflection, is not the immediate negative, but is the negative as sublated positiveness, the negative in and for itself, which positively rests upon itself. As immanent reflection, it negates its reference to its other. Its other is the positive, a self-subsisting being. Hence, the negative reference to this positive is the excluding of it from itself. The negative is the independently existing opposite, over against the positive, which is the determination of the sublated opposition, the whole opposition resting upon itself, opposed to the self-identical positiveness. The positive and the negative are such, therefore, not just in themselves, but in and for themselves. They are in themselves positive and negative when they are abstracted from their excluding reference to the other and are taken only in accordance with their determination. Something is, in itself, positive or negative when it is not supposed to be determined as positive or negative merely in contrast with the other. But the positive and the negative, taken not as a positiveness and hence not as opposed, are each an immediate being and non-being. They are, however, moments of opposition. Their in itself constitutes only the form of their immanent reflectedness. Something is said to be positive in itself outside the reference to something negative, and something negative in itself outside the reference to something negative. In this determination, merely the abstract moment of this reflectedness is held onto. However, to say that the positive and negative exist in themselves essentially implies that it to be opposed is not a mere moment, nor that it is just a matter of comparison, but that it is the determination of the sides themselves of the opposition. The sides, as positive or negative in themselves, are not, therefore, outside the reference to the other. On the contrary, this reference, precisely as exclusive, constitutes their determination or their in-itselfness. In this, therefore, they are at the same time in and for themselves. Remark. Mention must be made here of the concept of the positive and negative as it occurs in arithmetic. The concept is presupposed there as known, but since it is not grasped in its specific indifference, it is not immune to insoluble difficulties and complications. We have just seen how the two real determinations of the positive and negative, outside the simple concept of their opposition, came to be. Namely, only a differentiated, immediate existence stands in a first instance as ground, the simple, immanent reflection of which is distinguished from its positiveness from the opposition itself. This opposition, therefore, does not count as anything which is in and for itself, and although it does apply to its diverse sides so that each is an opposite in general, the sides remain nonetheless indifferent to it, and it is a matter of indifference which of the two is regarded as positive or negative. In a second instance, the positive is, however, the positive in itself, and the negative is the negative in itself, so that the two diverse sides are not indifferent to their respective determinations, but each is that determination in and for itself. We see these two forms of the positive and negative occur in arithmetic in the very first applications of them. In a first sense, the positive a and the negative a are simply opposite magnitudes. The a is a unit that stands by itself as the base of both. It itself indifferent towards the opposition and serving here as an inert foundation, without further conceptual consideration. The negative a is indeed designated as the negative, the positive a as the positive, but the one is just as much an opposite as the other. In another sense, the a is not only the simple unit, serving as the foundation, but as positive a and negative a, it is the reflection of these opposites into themselves. There are two different as at hand, and it is indifferent which of the two is designated as the positive or the negative. Each has a particular self-subsistence and is positive. According to the first sense, positive y and negative y equals 0, or O, or in negative 8 plus 3, the positive 3 are negatives in the 8. The opposites cancel themselves in combination. A 1-hour march is made to the east, and an equal march back to the west undoes it. So many are the debts pending that many less assets are available. So many are the assets available that many debts are absolved. The 1-hour march to the east is not in itself a positive march, nor is the march to the west a negative march. The directions are rather indifferent to this determinateness of opposition. Only a third standpoint, external to both, makes a positive of the one and the negative of the other. So also, debts are not a negative in and for themselves, but are such only with reference to the one in debt. For the creditor, they are a positive asset. They are a sum of money, or anything else of a given value, which, in accordance with standpoints external to it, is either debt or asset. The opposites do indeed cancel themselves in reference to each other, the result being equal to 0. But there is also present in them their identical reference, which is itself indifferent to the opposition. So the two constitute a 1. The same goes for the sum of money just mentioned, which is only one sum, or for the a, which is only 1a, whether in positive a or negative a, and for the 1-hour march as well, which covers one stretch of road, whether in the direction of east or west, and the same applies to an ordinate y, which is the same whether taken on one side or the other of the axis. Hence, positive y minus y equals y. It is only one ordinate with only one determination and a law for it. But in the second sense, the opposites are not only one indifferent something, but also two indifferent somethings. For as opposites, they are also reflected into themselves and thus stand as diverse. Thus, in negative 8 plus 3, there are 11 units altogether. Plus y, negative y are ordinates on opposite sides of the axis, where each is in existence indifferent to this limit and to their opposition. In this sense, positive y minus y equals 2y. Negative, also the road covered from east to west and back, is the sum of a twofold effort or the sum of two time periods. Likewise, in the economy of a state, a quantum of money or of assets is not just this one quantum as a mean of subsistence, but is rather doubled. It is a means of subsistence for both creditor and debtor. The capital of a state is calculated not merely as the sum of cash and of other real or liquid assets available to it, even less so as the sum of what is left over after the subtracting passive from active assets. For the capital, rather, even if its active and passive accounts nullify each other, remains, first, positive capital, as positive A minus A equals A, and second, since it is passive in a variety of ways, by being lent many times over, it is thereby a resource many times over. But not only are opposite magnitudes, on the one hand, just merely opposed, and on the other hand, real or indifferent. For although quantum itself is being indifferent to limit, the positive in itself and the negative in itself do also occur in it. Take the A, for instance, with no sign designation. If a sign is required, the presumption is that the A is positive. If opposition is required, though only in general, then it can just as well be taken as negative A. But the positive sign is the one given to it immediately, for the positive carries as such the particular meaning of the immediate, as self-identical in contrast to the opposition. Further, inasmuch as positive and negative magnitudes are added or subtracted, they count as positive or negative for themselves, not as acquiring this value externally, merely through the connective of addition or subtraction. In 8 minus negative 3, the first minus means opposite to 8, but the second, the negative 3, has the value of something opposed in itself outside the reference to 8. This is even more apparent in multiplication and division. Here, we must take the positive as essentially the not opposite, and the negative, on the contrary, as the opposite, not both determinations equally as just opposites in general. In the textbook of arithmetic, the demonstrations of how the signs function in these two types of reckoning do not go past the concept of opposite magnitudes in general, and, for this reason, they remain incomplete and land themselves in contradictions. In multiplication and division, the plus and minus obtain the more specific meaning of the positive and negative in itself, because the relation of the unit and amount in which the factors stand to each other is not a mere relation to the more and less, as in addition and subtraction, but as a qualitative relation, and for this reason the plus and minus also obtain the qualitative meaning of the positive and the negative. Without this determination, and merely from the concept of opposite magnitudes, the false conclusion can easily be drawn that if negative A times positive A equals negative A squared, then contrariwise positive A times negative A equals positive A squared, since one factor indicates the amount and the other the unit, and the amount is usually indicated by the factor that comes first. The two expressions, negative A plus times positive A and positive A times negative A, are distinguished by the fact that in the first the positive A is the unit and negative A the amount, and the contrary is the case in the other. Now, it is common to say with respect to the first expression that if I am to take positive A, the unit, negative A times, then I take it not merely A times, but also in the manner opposite to it, positive A times negative A. Therefore, since the A is plus, I have to take it negatively, and the product is negative A squared. But if, in the second case, negative A is to be taken positive A times, then negative A should be equally taken not negative A times, but in the determination opposite to it, namely positive A times. Therefore, on the argument of the first case, the product would have to be positive A squared. The same goes for division. This is the conclusion that necessarily follows when we take plus and minus as opposite magnitudes in general. In the first case, to the minus is attributed the power of altering the plus, yet, in the second case, the plus is supposed not to have the same power over the minus. despite the fact that it is as good as opposite determination of magnitude as the minus. In point of fact, the plus does not have this power, for it is to be taken here according to its qualitative determination as against the minus, since the factors stand in qualitative relation to each other. For this reason, the negative is therefore the inherently opposite as such, but the positive is the indeterminate, the indifferent in general. It, too, is indeed the negative, but the negative of the other, not a negative within it. A determination of negation thus derives solely by virtue of the negative at hand, not by the virtue of the positive. And so, negative a times negative a equals positive a squared, because the negative alpha, is not to be taken merely in the opposite manner, as it would have to be taken when multiplied negative a times, but because it is to be taken negatively, but the negation of the negation is the positive. C. Contradiction. 1. Difference in general contains both its sides as moments. In diversity, these sides fall apart as indifferent to each other, and in opposition as such, they are the moments of difference, each determined by the other and hence only moments. But in opposition, these moments are equally determined within, indifferent to each other and mutually exclusive, self-subsisting determinations of reflection. One is the positive and the other the negative, but the former as a positive with it which is such within, and the latter as a negative which is such within. Each has indifferent self-subsistence for itself by virtue of having the reference to its other within it, its other moment within it. Each moment is thus the whole self-contained opposition. As this whole, each moment is self-mediated through its other and contains this other. But it is also self-mediated through the non-being of its other, and is, therefore, a unity existing for itself and excluding the other from itself. Since the self-subsisting determination of reflection excludes the other in the same respect as it contains it, and is self-subsisting for precisely this reason, in its self-subsistence, the determination excludes its own self-subsistence from itself. For this self-subsistence consists in that it contains the determination, which is other than in itself, and does not refer to anything external for just this reason, but no less immediately in that it is itself and excludes from itself the determination that negates it, and so it is contradiction. Difference as such is already implicitly contradiction, for it is the unity of beings which are only insofar as they are not one, and it is the separation of beings which are only insofar as they are separated in the same reference connecting them. The positive and negative, however, are the posited contradiction, for as negative unities they are precisely their self-positing, and therefore therein each the sublating of itself and the positing of its opposite. They constitute determining reflection as exclusive, for the excluding is one act of distinguishing, and each of the distinguished beings, as exclusive, is itself the whole act of excluding, and so each excludes itself internally. If we look at the two self-subsisting determinations on reflection on their own, the positive is positiveness as reflected into likeness with itself. Positiveness which is not reference to another, hence subsistence, inasmuch as the positiveness is sublated and excluded. But with this, the positive makes itself into the reference of a non-being, into a positiveness. In this way, the positive is contradiction, in that, as the positing of self-identity by the excluding of the negative, it makes itself into a negative, hence into the other which it excludes from itself. This last, as excluded, is posited free of the one that excludes, hence as reflected into itself and itself as excluding. The reflection that excludes is thus the positing of the positive as excluding the other, so that this positing immediately is the positing of its other, which excludes it. This is the absolute contradiction of the positive, but it is immediately the absolute contradiction of the negative, the positing of both in one reflection. Considered in itself as against the positive, the negative is positiveness as reflected into unlikeness to itself, the negative as negative. But the negative is itself the unlike, the non-being of another. Consequently, reflection is, in its unlikeness, its reference rather to itself. Negation, in general, is the negative as quality or immediate determinateness, but taken as negative. It is referred to the negative of itself, to its other. If this second negative is taken only as identical with the first, then it is also only immediate, just like the first. They are not taken, therefore, as each the other of the other, hence not as negatives. The negative is not at all an immediate. But now, since each is moreover equally the same as what the other is, this reference connecting them as unequal is just as much their identical connection. This is therefore the same contradiction which the positive is, namely, positiveness or negation as self-reference. But the positive is only implicitly this contradiction, is contradiction only in itself. The negative, on the contrary, is the posited contradiction, for in its reflection into itself as a negative which is in and for itself, or a negative which is identical with itself, its determination is to be the not identical, the exclusion of identity. The negative is this, to be identical with itself over against identity, and consequently, because of this excluding reflection, to exclude itself from itself. The negative is, therefore, the whole opposition, the opposition which, as opposition, rests upon itself, distinction that absolutely does not refer itself to another. Distinction which, as opposition, excludes identity from itself, but thereby also excludes itself, for, as reference to itself, it determines itself as the very identity which it excludes. 2. Contradiction resolves itself. In the self-excluding reflection we have just considered, the positive and the negative, each in its self-subsistence, sublates itself. Each is simply the passing over, or rather the self-translating of itself into its opposite. This internal, ceaseless vanishing of the opposites is the first unity that arises by virtue of contradiction. It is the null. But contradiction does not merely contain the negative. It also contains the positive, or the self-excluding reflection is at the same time positing reflection. The result of contradiction is not only the null. The positive and the negative constitute the positedness of the self-subsistence. Their own self-negation sublates it. It is this positedness which, in truth, founders to the ground in contradiction. The immanent reflection by virtue of which the sides of opposition are turned into self-subsistent self-references is, first of all, their self-subsistence as distinct moments. Thus they are this self-subsistence only in themselves, for they are still opposites, and that they are, in themselves, self-subsistent constitutes their positiveness. But their excluding reflection sublates this positiveness, turns them into self-subsistent beings existing in and for themselves, such as are self-subsistent not only in themselves, but by virtue of their negative reference to their other. In this way, their self-subsistence is also posited. But further, by thus being posited as self-subsistent, they make themselves into a positedness. They fate themselves to founder, since they determine themselves as self-identical. Yet, in their self-identity, they are, rather, the negative, a self-identity which is reference to other. However, on closer examination, this excluding reflection is not only this formal determination. It is self-subsistence existing in itself, and the sublating of this positiveness is only through this sublating a unity that exists for itself and is in fact self-subsistent. Of course, through the sublating of otherness or positiveness or the negative of an other is indeed present again. But in fact, this negation is not just a return to the first immediate reference to the other. It is not positiveness as sublated immediacy, but positiveness as sublated positiveness. The excluding reflection of self-subsistence, since it is excluding, makes itself a positiveness, but it is just as much the sublation of its positiveness. It is sublating reference to itself. In that reference, it first sublates the negative, and it secondly posits itself as a negative. And it is only this posited negative that it sublates. In sublating the negative, it both posits and sublates it at the same time. In this way, the exclusive determination is itself that other of itself, of which it is the negation. The sublation of this positiveness is not, therefore, once more positiveness as the negative of another, but is self-withdrawal, positive self-unity. Self-subsistence is thus unity that turns back into itself by virtue of its own negation, for it turns into itself through the negation of its positiveness. It is the unity of essence, to be identical with itself through the negation not of another, but of itself. 3. According to this positive side, since self-subsistence in opposition as excluding reflection makes itself into a positiveness and equally sublates this positiveness, not only has the opposition foundered, but in foundering it has gone back to its foundation, to its ground. The excluding reflection of the self-subsisting opposition turns it into a negative, something only positive. It thereby reduces its formally self-subsisting determinations, the positive and the negative, to determinations which are only determinations. And the positiveness, since it is now made into positiveness, has simply gone back to its unity with itself. It is simple essence, but essence as ground. Through the sublating of the determinations of essence, which are in themselves self-contradictory, essence is restored, but restored in the determination of an exclusive, reflective unity. A simple unity which determines itself as negation, but in this positiveness is immediately like itself and withdrawn into itself. In the first place, therefore, because of its contradiction, the self-subsisting opposition goes back into a ground. This opposition is what comes first, the immediate from which the beginning is made, while the sublated opposition or the sublated positiveness is itself a positiveness. Accordingly, essence is as ground a positiveness, something that has become. But, conversely, only this has been posited, namely that the opposition or the positiveness is something sublated, is only a positiveness. As ground, therefore, essence is excluding reflection because it makes itself into a positiveness. Because the opposition from which the start was just now made and was the immediate is the merely posited determinate self-subsistence of essence. Because opposition only sublates itself within, whereas essence is, in its determinateness, reflected into itself. As ground, therefore, essence excludes itself from itself. It posits itself. Its positedness, which is what is excluded, is only as positedness, as identity of the negative with itself. This self-subsistent is the negative, posited as the negative, something self-contradictory, which, consequently, remains in the essence as its ground. The resolved contradiction is therefore ground, essence as unity of the positive and negative. In opposition, determinateness has progressed to self-subsistence, but ground is this self-subsistence as completed. In it, the negative is self-subsistent essence, but as negative and as self-identical in this negativity, ground is thus equally the positive. In ground, therefore, opposition and its contradiction are just as much removed as preserved. Ground is essence as positive self-identity, which, however, at the same time, refers itself to itself as negativity and therefore determines itself, making itself into an excluded positiveness. But this positiveness is the whole self-subsisting essence, and essence is ground, self-identical in its negation and positive. The self-contradictory, self-subsistent opposition was itself, therefore, already ground. All that was added to it was the determination of self-unity, which emerges as each of these self-subsisting opposites sublates itself and makes itself into its other, thereby founders and sinks to the ground, but therein also reunites itself with itself. Thus, in this foundering, that is, in its positiveness or in the negation, it rather is, for the first time, the essence that is reflected into itself and self-identical. Remark 1. The positive and the negative are the same. This is a maxim of external reflection, for it sets up a comparison between the two terms, but it is not an external comparison that should be drawn between them, or, for that matter, between any two other categories. The categories must, rather, be considered on their own, that is to say, it is their own reflection that must be considered. And we have seen in this reflection that each is the reflective shining of itself in the other, and itself the positing of itself as the other. Superficial thought that does not consider the positive and the negative as they are in themselves can of course be made aware of the instability of these distinct terms, which it assumes to be fixed in their opposition to each other, by being referred to the act of comparing. The most cursory experiment in reflective thought will demonstrate that if something is determined as a positive and is then taken as the starting point, this same something will have immediately turned into the process into a negative, and vice versa. Anything negatively determined will have turned into a positive. It will demonstrate that reflective thinking gets confused and runs into contradictions in these determinations. Ignorance of their nature will interpret this confusion as a misstep that should not occur, and will ascribe it to a subjective failure. Indeed, the shifting back and forth from one determination to the other will remain in mere confusion as long as there is no awareness of the necessity of the alteration. But even to external reflection, it will be a matter of simple consideration that the positive, to start with, is not a simple identity, but is rather, on the one hand, opposed to the negative, has meaning only in this reference to it, and therefore entails the negative in its very concept, and, on the other hand, is inherently the self-referring negation of mere positiveness or of the negative, and therefore is itself implicitly the absolute negation. Similarly, the negative that stands over against the positive has meaning only in thus referring to its other. It contains it, therefore, in its concept. But the negative has a self-subsistence of its own, also without the reference to the positive. It is self-identical. Thus, it is itself what the positive was supposed to be. The opposition of positive and negative is normally taken in the sense that the former, even though its name conveys positiveness, is to be supposed as objective. The latter, instead, as something subjective that only belongs to an external reflection and has nothing to do with what exists objectively in and for itself, even if the latter, if even is, for the latter, nothing at all. And in fact, if the negative only expressed a subjectively arbitrary abstraction or a determination of external comparison, then it would indeed be for the positive nothing at all. That is, there would be no reference in the positive to such an empty abstraction. But then its determination, that it is a positive would equally be only external to it. As an example of the fixed opposition of these determinations of reflection, take light in general to be the solely positive and darkness the solely negative. But light has, in its unending expansion and power to suscitate and vivify, the nature of absolute negativity. Darkness, on the other hand, as a non-manifold or as the non-self-differentiating womb of generation, is simple self-identity, the positive. In the way it is taken, it is only a negative, in the sense that it is the mere absence of light, nothing at all for itself, so that light, in referring to it, would not be referring to another, but purely to itself, would therefore simply disappear before it. But surely light is dimmed to gray by darkness, and, besides this merely quantitative alteration, it also suffers the qualitative one of being determined as color by referring to darkness. So also, virtue, for example, is not without struggle. It is rather the highest, the perfect struggle, and thus not only a positive, but rather absolute negativity. Virtue is virtue, not just by comparison to vice, but for the opposition and the combat in it. Or again, vice is not only the lack of virtue. Innocence, too, is such a lack, and distinct from virtue not just in the eyes of external reflection, but as opposed to virtue in itself. It is evil. Evil consists in maintaining one's own ground as against the good. It is positive negativity. Innocence, on the other hand, as the lack of both good and evil, is indifferent to these determinations, is neither positive nor negative. But at the same time, this lack must also be taken also as a determinateness, and, as such, on the one hand, is to be considered as the positive nature of something, just as, on the other, as referring to an opposite. And thus, all natures fall from innocence, and their indifferent self-identity. Because of what they are in themselves, they refer to their other, and therefore they cause themselves to founder, or, positively expressed, they return to their ground. Truth, also, is the positive as the knowledge that agrees with the object. But it is this likeness to itself only in so far as knowledge has related itself negatively to the other, has penetrated the object and sublated the negation which the latter is. Error is something positive as the self-aware and deliberate assertion of something which has no existence in and for itself. Ignorance, for its part, is either something indifferent to truth and error, hence neither positively nor negatively determined, its determination a lack, and thus the domain of external reflection. Or, objectively taken as the defining determination of a nature, an instinct that is directed against itself, a negative containing a positive direction within it. To perceive and to be mindful of this nature, of the determinations of reflection, is among the most important steps in cognition. That their truth consists only in the reference to one another, and hence that each contains the other within its very concept. Without this recognition, no proper step in philosophy can be made. Remark 2. The determination of opposition has equally been made into a proposition, the so-called principle of the excluded middle. Something is either A or not A. There is no third. The principle contains, first, that everything is an opposite, determined as either positive or negative. It is an important principle, necessary because identity passes over into diversity and diversity into opposition. But this is not the sense in which it is normally understood, for its ordinary meaning amounts rather to just this, that, of all the predicates, either this one here or its non-being comes to a thing. Here, the opposite of the predicate signifies a mere lack, or rather indeterminateness, and the principle is so insignificant that it is hardly worth the effort of enunciating it. If the predicates green, sweet, square are taken, and it is assumed that they are all taken, and then it is said of spirit that it is either sweet or not sweet, green or not green, and so on. This is a triviality that leads nowhere. Determinateness, the predicate, is referring to something. This something is determined, the principle says. Now, what the principle ought essentially to apply is that the determinateness should further determine itself, that it becomes determinateness in itself, opposition. Instead of this, however, it only goes, in the trivial sense just mentioned, from determinateness over to its non-being in general, goes back to indeterminateness. The principle of the excluded middle is further distinguished from the previously examined principles of identity or contradiction that said, nothing is A and not A at the same time. What this implies is that there is nothing which is not either A or not A. That there is no third, that there is no third that would be indifferent to that opposition. But, in fact, a third indifferent is given in the principle itself, for the A is there. This A is neither positive A nor negative A, and just as much also positive A and negative A. The something, which ought to have been either positive A or negative A, is here attached to the positive A as well as the negative A. And, again, inasmuch as it is attached to the A, it ought not to be attached to the negative A, just as it ought not to be attached to the A inasmuch as it is to the not A. The something itself is therefore the third, which ought to have been excluded. Hence, in this something, the opposite determinations are equally posited and sublated. The third, which is here in the shape of an inert something, when taken more profoundly, is the unity of the reflection into which the opposition returns as into ground. Remark 3. Now, if the first determinations of reflection, identity, diversity, and opposition have been formulated each as a principle, all the more should the one determination into which they pass over as in their truth, namely, contradiction, be grasped and enunciated as a principle. All things are in themselves contradictory, in the sense, moreover, that as contrasted with each other, this proposition expresses rather the truth and the essence of things. The contradiction that emerges in opposition is only the developed nothing which is contained in identity, and came to the fore in the claim that the principle of identity says nothing. This negation further determines itself into difference and into opposition, which is now the posited contradiction. It is, however, one of the basic prejudices of previous logic and of ordinary thought that contradiction is not essential and imminent a determination as identity. But in fact, if order of precedence were an issue and the two determinations were to be held separate, it would be the principle of contradiction that should be taken as the more profound and the more essential. For, in contrast to it, identity is only the determination of simple immediacy, of inert being. Whereas contradiction is the root of all movement in life. It is only insofar as something has a contradiction within it that it moves, as possessed of instinct and activity. Contradiction is ordinarily the first to be kept away from things, away from any existent and from the true. As the saying goes, there is nothing contradictory. For the rest, it is relegated to subjective reflection, which allegedly first posits it by the way of reference and comparison. And even within this reflection, it is not really there, for the contradictory cannot supposedly be represented or thought. Whether it occurs in actuality or in the reflection of thought, it is universally reckoned as an accident, an abnormality, as it were, a momentary fit of sickness. Now, as regards the claim that there is no contradiction, that none is to be found, we need not worry on account of such protestations. An absolute determination of essence must be found in every experience, in anything actual, just as in every concept. We have already remarked this much earlier on in connection with the infinite, which is contradiction as displayed in the sphere of being, but Ordinary experience itself testifies that there do exist at least a great many contradictory things, contradictory dispositions, etc., of which the contradiction is present, not in any external reflection, but right in them. Nor is contradiction to be taken as an abnormality, which happens only here and there, but is rather the negative in its essential determination, the principle of all self-movement, which consists in nothing else than in the display of contradiction. External, sensuous motion is itself contradiction's immediate existence. Something moves, not because now it is here and there at another now, but because in one and the same now it is here and not here. Because in this here it is and is not at the same time. One must concede to the dialecticians of old the contradictions which they pointed to in motion. But what follows from them is not that motion is not, but that it is, rather, contradiction as existent. Internal self-movement proper, drive in general, the appetite or nisus of the monad, the entelechy of the absolute simple essence, is likewise nothing else than that something is, in itself and the lack of itself, the negative, in one and the same respect. Abstract self-identity is not yet vitality, but the positive, since implicitly it is negativity, goes out of itself and sets its alteration in motion. Something is alive, therefore, only to the extent that it contains contradiction within itself. Indeed, forces this to hold and endure contradiction within. If, on the contrary, a concrete existent were not capable of overreaching its positive determination and grasping the negative at the same time, holding the two firmly together, if it were not capable of harboring contradiction within it, it would not then be a living unity as such, not a ground, and in contradiction it would founder and sink to the ground. Speculative thought consists only in this, in holding firm to contradiction and to itself in the contradiction, but not in the sense that, as it happens in ordinary thought, it would let itself be ruled by it and allow it to dissolve its determinations into just other determinations or into nothing. If to ordinary thought, the contradiction which is in motion, in a drive and the like, remains concealed in the simplicity of such determinations, contradiction is, on the other hand, immediately displayed in the determinations of a relation. The most trivial of examples, above and under, right and left, father and son, and so on ad infinitum, all contain opposition within one and the same term. Above is what under is not. Above is determined by just this, not to be under. It is only to the extent that an under is, and contrariwise. Father is the other of son, and son the other of father, and each is the only as this other of the other. And the one determination is at the same time only with reference to the other. Their being is one subsisting. The father is indeed something for itself outside this reference to the son, but then he is not father, but a man in general. The same applies to the above and under, right and left. They too are something outside the reference when reflected into themselves, but just places in general. Opposites entail contradiction inasmuch as, in negatively referring to each other, they sublate each other reciprocally and are indifferent to each other. Ordinary thought, when it passes over to the moment of indifference, forgets there the negative unity of the opposites, and therefore holds on to them only as different in general. And, of course, in this general determination, right is no longer right, left no longer left, and so on. But if right and left are in fact there, present to the thought, then they are present to it in determinations which are self-negating, each negating itself in the other, and yet, in this unity, also not negating itself, but existing indifferently for itself. Ordinary thought, therefore, does have contradiction everywhere for content, but fails to become aware of it. It remains an external reflection that simply shifts from likeness to unlikeness, or from the negative reference connecting distinct terms to their immanent reflectedness. It holds these two determinations apart, external to each other, and has only them in mind, not the transition from the one into the other, which is the essential and that which contains the contradiction. The speculative reflection of spirit, to mention it here, consists on the contrary in grasping and enunciating contradiction. Although it might not express the concept of things and their relations and has only representational determinations for its content, it nevertheless connects these in reference that contains their contradiction, and lets their concept reflectively shine through the contradiction. But thoughtful reason sharpens, as it were, the blunt difference of diverse terms, the mere manifold of representation to essential distinction to opposition. Only when driven to the extreme of contradiction are the many of that manifold quickened and alive to each other. They hold the negativity in them which is the inner pulse of the self-movement in life. We have already remarked concerning the ontological proof of God's existence that the determination on which it is based is that the sum total of all realities. It is customary regarding this determination first to demonstrate that it is possible because it entails no contradiction, since reality is taken here only as reality without restrictions. We pointed out that this concept, the sum total of all realities, is thereby reduced to simple indeterminate being, or, if the realities are in fact taken as severally determinate, to the sum total of all negations. And if the distinction differentiating them is then taken with greater precision, the difference turns into opposition, and, consequently, into contradiction, and the sum total of all realities in general into absolute internal contradiction. The usual horror which ordinary, not speculative, thought has of contradiction, as nature has of the vacuum, rejects this consequence, for it remains at the one-sided consideration that contradiction revolves into nothing without recognizing its positive side, where it becomes absolute activity and absolute ground. The upshot of this examination of the nature of contradiction is that if a contradiction can be pointed out in something by itself, this is still not, as it were, a blemish, not a defect or a failure. On the contrary, every determination, anything concrete, every concept, is essentially a unity of distinguished and distinguishable elements, which, by virtue of the determinate essential difference, pass over into elements which are contradictory. This contradictoriness, of course, resolves itself into nothing. It goes back into its negative unity. A thing, a subject, a concept, is then precisely this negative unity. It is something inherently self-contradictory, but it is no less the resolved contradiction. It is the ground which contains the determinations it bears. The thing, the subject, or the concept, each as reflected into itself within this sphere, is their contradiction as resolved. But the whole sphere of each is, in its turn, determinate, diverse, and therefore finite. And this means contradictory. The sphere is not itself the resolution of its higher contradiction, but has yet a higher sphere for its negative unity, for its ground. Finite things, in their indifferent variety, are therefore just this: to be contradictory, internally fractured and bound to return to their ground. As we shall see in due course, the true inference from the finite and accidental to an absolutely necessary being does not consist in inferring the latter from that finite and accidental as a being which is and remains the ground of the inference, but from it as a being, which is only falling, as accidentally from the Latin cadere immediately conveys, a being inherently self-contradictory. Or rather, the inference consists in demonstrating that accidental being makes in itself its return to its ground, and is there sublated. In addition, that in this return to the ground, it posits the latter in such a manner that it makes itself rather into a positedness. In customary inference, the being of the finite appears to be the ground of the absolute, because the finite is, the absolute is. But the truth is that the absolute is because the finite is the eminently self-contradictory opposition, because it is not. In the former meaning, the conclusion is that the being of the finite is the being of the absolute, but in the latter, that the non-being of the finite is the being of the absolute. And that is going to bring us to the end of the essentialities or the determinations of reflection. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. I didn't have a whole lot to add here because the first half of this, at least the points of difference, were what we were talking about yesterday with the lighter, and this was already going to be 2 hours plus, so I'm not going to add these same thoughts again. And then the second half really is just clarification of terms, right? If you stop and look at them, they are self-evident as he is explaining them. They may not have been self-evident before they were explained, but as they are being explained, they pretty much define themselves exactly as he lays out, and it absolutely makes sense. And so I didn't have a whole lot to add. But if you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, and a follow. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree with anything that was stated. Put it in the box down below. And if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is another work you would like to see me discuss or just read aloud, drop that in the box as well. And if you really like what I'm doing, hit me with that super thanks. Consider a membership or picking up a copy of my book. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.